Hello there. Welcome to part 2 of this knife making demonstration. Today I'm going to be adding a handle. Using a ruler I can see that I need 4.5 inches of handle. Something that I quite like doing with handles is combining antler and wood. In this case 4.5 divides evenly into 3, so I've decided that my handle is going to consist of 3 pieces 1.5 inches long. First thing to do is decide which bit of antler to use. White-tailed deer antler can be a little bit frustrating because it's so curved. This is one benefit of combining antler and wood. You get to use small sections. The wood I'm going to be using is black walnut. The dark color of the wood contrasts really nicely against the white of the antler. And besides that, it's locally available and abundant. I'm using a hacksaw to cut the antler. Other saws don't fare so well against bone. It's a good idea to cut antler using a slightly blunt saw, as the bone dust will gum up the teeth and make it useless for metal. It can be frustrating cutting antler. Because the pieces are round and uneven, a vise doesn't tend to hold them very well. What's worse is that if you clamp it too tight, you'll crush the antler. Now I trace the piece of antler onto the wood, so that I know which pieces I can cut off easily. When cutting with the grain, I find it easier to use a chisel than a saw. Now we go back to the belt sander. What I'm doing here is removing all the rough spots and trying to make the antler pieces a more uniform shape. After watching the previous video, you've probably had enough of looking at belt sanders, so I'll skip this bit. Now I drill a hole through each of the handle pieces. When drilling antler, it's preferable to drill through the marrow at the center of the piece. It's quite a bit easier to drill, and it's not as useful as the rest of the material once you've finished. You want to drill the hole before shaping the pieces. It's very easy to drill a hole that's not perfectly aligned with your piece. If you haven't shaped it yet, you can compensate for a poorly drilled hole by shaping it differently. Now to make each of the pieces fit on the tang of the knife. To start this off, I'm using a handheld rotary tool. It removes the material fairly quickly, but it's clumsy and it's pretty easy to make the holes too big. Now that I've got the holes close, I switch to a needle file. Needle files are very time consuming. However, they let you make a very precisely fitting handle. Drilling antler always reminds me of being at the dentist. Antler dust smells the same as when the dentist is grinding your teeth. Now the pieces are fitted to the tang. However, they aren't perfectly square against each other, so let's fix that. Yet more grinding. Back before I started doing this, the idea of a bladesmith and a blacksmith were just interchangeable to me. Slaving over a hot forge, hitting pieces of metal with a great big hammer, that was my idea. The reality is that blacksmithing has very little to do with bladesmithing. Making a knife, handle, scabbard, fittings and all, takes me about 5 or 6 hours. As I mentioned in the previous video, only about a half hour of that is spent on the forge. Now that I've squared everything up, I can see that I need to remove a little bit more wood from the midsection. Now back to the grinder to do some rough shaping. I'm trying to get each of the pieces to be roughly the same diameter as each other. To aid in this, I slot them onto the tang of the knife. This helps me hold them together. I haven't ground a proper edge onto the blade yet, so this is still relatively safe to do. I want the handle to be slightly concave in the center to aid with grip, so I'm using the top of the grinder to help with that. In addition to the handle components, I'm going to need a couple of metal fittings. I'm making these out of a piece of angle iron that was left over from a previous project. For the guard, I'm drilling 2 holes adjacent to each other. For the pommel, I just want one hole that's barely big enough to fit over the end of the tang. Now I've got to file out the hole in the guard such that it will fit onto the knife. The rotary tool doesn't work very well here, so I just got to do it by hand. Once I got that done, then it's time to cut out the fittings from the piece of metal. And then you guessed it, back to the grinder. Because the fittings are small and heat up quickly, I use a pair of pliers so that I don't have to keep quenching them. Now that I've finished the rough work on all of the components, it's time to assemble the hilt. Now to peen the tang. I have the blade wrapped in leather before I clamp it. This leather provides some extra grip for the vise and prevents the vise from gouging the steel as I hammer it down. You have to be very careful here that you're hitting the tang dead center. You want the end of it to mushroom out. You don't want it to bend in the middle. If it starts to bend in the middle, you have to stop and take it apart, otherwise you're just going to crack your handle. Every few blows I make sure to tap the handle rather than the tang. This makes sure that everything is sitting snugly against the blade guard. You know you're finished when you can't wiggle any of the handle components anymore. Okay, that feels pretty good. Now let's finish shaping the handle. The first thing I do is I use the corner of the grinder over each of the seams to make sure that the pieces are perfectly flush. I like to assemble the handle before I finish shaping it. When I do it the other way around, the pieces have an unfortunate tendency to shift just a tiny bit and ruin all my hard work. Once I finish shaping it, the handle is generally a little bit loose. This is good. I just go back to the vise, give it a couple more taps, and then I can be confident that the peen will hold. Here we are after all the shaping is done. The only thing left to do is the final polish. This involves rubbing the blade in consecutively finer grained sandpaper. It takes a very long time and is by far the most boring part of this long, boring process. So I'm just going to skip ahead to the finished product. And here we have the finished knife. Amazing the difference a bit of polish makes. I think it turned out pretty good, though it would have been nicer if the blade was about 1.5 inches longer. I guess that's it for today's video. I'll follow this up with a part 3 in which I make a scabbard at some point. Until then, bye-bye.